If I say the phrase social justice, half of you probably just got nervous and the other half probably just got angry. It's become this massive political grenade in the church, but here's the problem. You can't actually read the Bible without running into matters of justice on almost every page. So, how do we care about the oppressed without just copying a political talking point? Let's get into it. Welcome to the Easy Approach.
Take it easy. Take it easy.
All right, everybody, welcome in to the Easy Approach. I am Nate, and I'm joined by my good buddy Tony.
Hello, hello.
And once again, we are joined by the...
Incomparable.
That's the word I was trying to think of.
Gotcha.
The incomparable Michael, which does make you sound like a magician, Michael. Yeah. How are you fellas doing today?
Oh, not too shabby. Not too shabby at all.
Not bad at all.
Not too shabby on a Sunday
Nice sleepy
afternoon.
Sunday.
I don't know what the weather's like where you're at. Tony, you're a few hours from me, and Michael, you're more than a few hours from me, but it is sunny with a high of 75 right now.
Yeah,
Hey,
it's been good weather, which is very foreign for Texas, I feel like. It's pretty nice out.
Lately. We're currently in the process of building a home,
Ooh.
and the amount of days that have gone according to plan is definitely more than the amount of days. No, the reverse is definitely less than the amount of days that have not gone according to plan, namely due to weather. Like, it is just, it's raining and it's freezing and it's raining and it's freezing, and things don't really happen on the weekend as much. So every Saturday and Sunday are beautiful and sunny and perfect, and then Monday it's pouring rain again, and then by Thursday it's frozen again, and then it's Texas. So Saturday it's back to like 78 degrees. I don't know what Texas even is.
If you don't mind humoring me for a little bit as we segue into our topic. First of all, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for another one of our podcasts. We have very, very easy questions, not hard, not difficult whatsoever, that we like to talk about. But it's like, I have this thing that I joke about with my wife a lot, right? And this is where I say, bear with me, guys. Where we're like meeting new people, or we're at a party or some kind of social event where maybe one of us wants to be there and the other one doesn't. I'll let you guys figure out which one belongs to which category there.
Which one you are. It's clearly her, since you're such a social butterfly.
But like, it's just so funny, like how, when you're trying to make small talk with people and conversations with people, and not to make fun of us, but yes, I'm the first person to make fun of myself. We love talking about weather, we love talking about how's things been lately. And my favorite topic, what do you do for work? Tell me about work, because those are some of the most interesting topics, right?
Yeah. Or if it's a group of guys, I really try to gravitate towards some kind of sport, usually basketball or football. Be like, so how about
that
them?
One is at least a good topic, though.
How about them Cowboys? I freaking hate the Cowboys, but if it means avoiding social awkwardness, I will talk about the Cowboys and pretend that I'm into them.
I'm into hating them. How about that?
So what do you guys do for work? That's where you were going, right? You wanted to talk
Exactly. And so, as the astute listener can tell, one of maybe my personal inspirations for a podcast like this is, God forbid, what if we actually talk about the things that have some depth to them, some heaviness to them? But it's hard in today's age, right? It doesn't just come naturally, and at the same time, there's a lot of things going on in our society where we don't want to say the wrong thing or come off the wrong way, And so today's topic, I kind of feel like for me, can fit into that strange category of, I want to talk about something that has depth. I want to talk about something that honestly, most people have a very unique and valuable perspective on this. But how do you do it without stepping on toes, and at the same time without watering down your own opinion for someone else's approval,
Yeah.
So I just wanted to preface that because I felt like that connected to our intro there.
Yeah, just prep everyone for the landmine they're about to step on.
Exactly.
So would you just gonna leave us hanging there, or do you
Oh
want to
yeah,
introduce the
that's
topic?
right, man. That's the landmine. Just push them
That's
into
it.
the field and just start walking, people.
Yeah. That was the podcast, everyone. Tune in next week to see if we talk about anything.
The one other thing I actually did wanted to connect was if you were fortunate enough to join us in our last episode where we did talk about, the importance of understanding the Bible from a perspective of what was the original author trying to communicate to the original audience in many different areas, not just the Bible as one cohesive book as a whole that is giving one solid message that's objective and undeniable, but how the unfortunate truth is there is a lot of nuance. It's not black and white. And there's been a lot of abuse because of that having to determine what is the correct nuance and what isn't. And so I think that foundational conversation that we had also can help us navigate through this landmine of talking about today's society and a little bit of, what is an actual Christian view or Christian principles. What are we as Christians trying to say is the beliefs that we build our social justice views on, the impact that society is going through tons of different social justice issues. Where are we coming from, and why are we coming from that? So that's probably the mindful intro that Nate wanted.
There you go. You nailed it. You read my mind. Yeah, social justice. What's the deal with social justice? That's what we're revolving around.
That was way better
today.
than last episode.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been brushing up on my Jerry. What can I say?
Good old Seinfeld.
No, anyone who's actually good at impressions is just cringed immediately when I did that.
Oh man, it is a talent I wish I had.
Yeah, it's just not it wasn't in the genetic cards for me. I don't know. Yeah, I mean the term social justice, that's what we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
And then a Christian's approach or the biblical approach to social justice. Because man, it's even just the term social justice, it's going to have a response. It's going to provoke a response in anyone hearing that term. For some people, it's like their beating heart, right?
Yeah.
It's like, this is what I live for. This is the greatest good is social justice. And for other people, they'll immediately get frustrated because it represents to them a certain category of people or values or actions or a trend society's heading in or whatever else. So I want to get a temperature check here, a heat check. When I say the term social justice, what is the first response that you guys have?
Michael, as our esteemed guest, I will go ahead and let you take a crack.
Yeah,
The
I was
incomparable.
I was trying to decide if I wanted to go serious or if I wanted to.
Both is always a good
go
answer.
We can
Sounds
keep
like-
it light and breezy to start off with.
I don't know. So my first reaction to hearing social justice is just like, I don't know, full butt cheek clench, because I'm expecting that there's going to be some kind of knockdown, drag out sort of argument that's about to ensue, because it's I feel like everyone has such a loaded and, I don't know, just white knuckle sort of response to it. Because I don't know, I feel like it's so almost hyper politicized that it's become so a left and right kind of a thing. So you're expecting just battle to commence, which I don't think is how it's supposed to be. But at least for Americans, I feel like that's what it's become recently.
Yeah, there's definitely a part of that, what you were saying, Michael, on the macro scale that is unfortunately very, very true. And, I was alluding to that a little bit with just the heaviness of the topic can unfortunately trigger some people, or you can walk into a situation without knowing that you're walking into it. On the other side of that spectrum, for me, on the micro, unfortunately, unfortunately or fortunately, I have been both blessed and burdened by a number of people in my life who have had to deal with struggles when it comes to this topic in their own personal life. And that shows in a bunch of different ways. And so when you ask that question, Nate, I do tend to take it a little bit more on the micro side than the macro. And I think about some of the very unfortunate, very terrible situations that some of my friends have gone through, or at least helped other people go through. Take abuse, and like women's abuse or women's shelters is something that I think about right away, and the unfortunate necessity of we need, like, take someone who does work in a women's shelter, and the reason why that exists. It sucks. Something like that shouldn't need to exist, but it does in reality. And we are very blessed for those people who go out of their way and do spearhead that and do make that their life and their passion. But like I said, micro versus macro can be a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, a few weeks ago we had a topic that we discussed together about, like, what does it actually mean to be a Christian?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sometimes terms or groups of terms can take on a life of their own, apart from the
Yes.
original intention, or
Yes.
apart from what the original words mean. And I think I mentioned it during that episode, but I often go into groups of like Bible students, like in Bible schools, and teach for days or weeks at a time. And one thing that never changes is the importance of defining terms.
Absolutely.
So it's like salvation. Yes, that's a very Christian-y word, but what do we mean when we say salvation? And typically, there's very little agreement in the room about exactly what this word means. So it's like, well, let's put our finger on it. Like, what did it mean in that time from that speaker in like the biblical context? So I want to do that with just kind of disseminate a little bit with social justice as a movement,
Yes.
and the kinds of individuals that would say, like social justice is the most important thing to me in the year of our Lord 2025, like activism in the modern sense. Disseminate that from like what the words actually mean, like at their core. Because if we're talking about as followers of Jesus, what our approach to social justice ought to be, or what Jesus's approach was and would be today, getting down to our understanding our terms, or being on the same page with our terms, is pretty important. I mean, so strictly speaking, like social justice, broadly speaking, just means justice in the social sphere.
Yeah.
Justice occurring in a sphere of people interrelating in society and in culture and whatever else. So, like, from that perspective, yes, like the Bible's certainly concerned about justice.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was certainly concerned about justice. I think we probably need to define the word justice from a purely biblical standpoint first, before we bring in any modern social aspect to that.
Yeah, that
So
totally makes sense.
I want to ask you guys, from a biblical perspective, when I say justice, what do you think?
Well, for me, justice is getting what you deserve, right? You you make a choice, you take an action, and that action has consequences. Whenever it was an intended action, or more importantly, intended consequences or not, those actions do have consequences. And there are plenty of times, like especially, I think, if I'm trying to stay rooted biblically, where there have been very wicked people who made many wicked choices, and there was a social cry of that person should have consequences for how terrible or wicked of an individual or a leader or whatever that person, and that person did not or did get the consequences of their choices.
Yeah. Michael, any thoughts?
When I think of at least what I can understand is like a biblical vision of justice. Justice, I think, is something that's like rooted in God's character. And so it's making sure that, those who are doing wrong are being called to account for their wrongs, but I think there's also restoration that is a part of that. And so, I mean, so much of, I think, well, Old Testament, I'm thinking prophets especially, but there is a care for the poor, widows, orphans, and all of that. That's supposed to be a part of that. He's regularly calling his people to do that. And so I tend to think that justice is an expression of love that corrects what is wrong, both by wrongdoer and the uplifting of those those who've been wronged.
Yeah. Well put. Well put. I think that's a really, really helpful point you just made about not just justice, not just being about getting what you deserve. That is an element of it, but that's more, I think, geared towards the idea of the system, like a system that attempts to achieve justice by punishing the wrongdoer and deterring potential wrongdoers. I think justice as a concept is like this holistic sense in which right is happening.
Yeah.
Like there isn't damage happening. If justice existed in perfect equilibrium, then what is right would be achieved. So it's like peace and goodness. Like from a biblical perspective, that's like love and peace and goodness and God's vision, Jesus' vision of humanity being like actualized. I think that's justice in the purest sense. And then achieving justice is much more complicated because people do terrible things to each other. And then it's like holding accountable, and then holding accountable in such a way that it deters, like I said, the potential wrongdoers. So yes, I agree with both of you guys. You both keyed in on two parts of the same coin here, that from a biblical perspective, it is about like a right equilibrium, that sense of like peace or shalom being like everything is in equilibrium. Justice is like another element of that equilibrium in which wrongdoing, if justice was perfectly achieved, wrongdoing isn't occurring. Like brokenness, wounds to each other, war, manipulation, abuse, all these things are not happening. And then you get into the justice system about how to achieve justice. That's where we really start having some disagreements, I think, about how justice can be achieved. I think probably everybody wants, well, probably most people want justice. It's just how do we get there?
They want justice when it doesn't mean throwing themselves or someone they know under that particular bus.
Yeah.
But that might
fair
be
enough.
a bit of a tangent.
Everyone wants justice unless justice is coming for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I want to kind of apply this question to because we asked like the Christian perspective of social justice, but in that episode about what is a Christian, we really kind of keyed on the idea of Christianity being about following Jesus into his vision of what humanity should be. That's what it means to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus and his teaching and his way of life. So with that in mind, in Jesus' like short ministry that we can read about in the Bible, how do you see justice, and you could say on a social level, so social justice in that sense, but how do you see or not see justice being emphasized in his ministry?
At least in terms of Jesus's ministry. So like Luke has his ministry kick off with his reading from Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord's upon me, anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, liberty to captives, recovery of sight to blind, set at liberty the oppressed, so on and so forth.
The ani in Hebrew, right? The lowest, the poor, the broken.
Yeah. And then, then it launches into stories of his ministry where he's doing exactly that. He heals, the poor and the broken and the needy. He eats with those who are considered sinners and the absolute lowest of the low in society, from tax collectors to prostitutes. And, that's considered, and healing lepers and touching them. And so like all of this is considered either A, gross, or B, just shockingly wrong, kind of like in its own right to be even associated with that. Yet, that was Jesus's. I think we can learn something about justice from that. He went to the lowest and was working to lift them up.
Yeah, I
and
want to
honestly treat them like humans.
absolutely. I want to piggyback off of that a little bit, Michael. There's some like when you brought up tax collectors, for example, it triggered something in me, like just an understanding of, why it was such a upside down way of thinking, that why Jesus hanging out with the prostitutes and the tax collectors and all these lowest of the lows. Some of them are obvious, but like take the tax collectors and like what they represented, like these were typically, and of course it's not a blanket statement, but from my perspective, these are typically people who came from the community. They're Jewish people, or they're people that once belonged a part of the family. And for the sake of money, for the sake of bettering themselves, their selfishness, they decided to essentially, in the eyes of everyone else, betray their own community. Because like the Jewish people, right, Nate, they were conquered. They were a conquered people. And Caesar was the number one person who probably in the Jewish people's eyes went without justice that he rightfully deserved. And so when you had Jesus coming along and doing all these things, and there was like a fundamental misunderstanding of the topic we're talking about, right? The fundamental misunderstanding of what justice is really going to look like when the Messiah comes. And
Yep.
these people, when they saw Jesus do X, Y, and Z that we see, and we're like, oh yeah, of course, that's very Jesus-y. But to a good Jewish person, it blew their mind, because if he really cared about justice, he would be making sure that the Romans get what they deserve, get their justice. And these tax collectors, no, 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 they represent the worst of us. Like because they have betrayed us, and because they do not pursue justice,
Yeah.
I can see, if I try to put myself in their shoes, I can see why they were so angry at tax collectors, so angry at anyone who would act like it's okay to treat them like normal people, because it's like you say you care about someone getting what they deserve, about actual justice, yet here you are doing something that is so backwards to what we think justice really is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like in the ministry of Jesus, for sure, there's a variety of visions for how to achieve justice. The Romans have their own vision, which is Pax Romana, right? You
Roman
achieve peace and justice through
I have a really big stick.
horrific violence.
Everything's real peaceful when everyone is dead.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah. And then, many of the Jews, I would even argue most of the Jews in the first century, their vision of how to achieve justice and ultimately like the peace of God. Because in that sense, they're like, as I mentioned before, the idea of peace and justice in a biblical sense they're not separate things. They're very much connected. That sense of equilibrium, that sense of rightness, like things are the way they ought to be. The common Jewish vision of how to achieve that was kind of encapsulated more in the Zealots than it was in the ministry of Jesus.
Absolutely.
That radical, violent, movement, like raiders from the hills that would come down and kill as many Romans as they could get their hands on. That vision of rebellion against the Roman Empire and establishing their own kingdom, and God throwing his weight behind you, and a new David, a new Messiah coming down and slaughtering the enemy and establishing, the kingdom of God upon earth, and therefore justice will be achieved, and that sort of thing. That's definitely not what you see with Jesus. Jesus comes along, and he, as you mentioned, Michael, he cares about the lowly, the poor, the broken, the sick, the specifically not just like economically poor, but that word in Hebrew I mentioned before, the ani, is the lowest of the lowest rung on the ladder. like the social outcasts, the ones that for whatever reason would be the most left out, the most neglected, the most ostracized. He gears so much of what he does towards them. But then he also, like, a core part of how he did it was in bringing people alongside him and teaching them to do the exact same thing. And what kind of people did he very intentionally and I think specifically choose to be alongside him?
Well, it wasn't
Do you
the
have
leaders, right?
Well, do you have like that violent zealot movement represented in his follower group?
You sure do.
You sure do.
Yeah.
There's Simon the Zealot, who's like, his vision of justice was slaughtering the Romans, slaughtering the race traders. And when you think of race traders to the Jewish people, in that point in history, well, you think of what you said, Tony.
Mhm. Yeah.
The tax collectors. Do we
Matthew
see
the
the tax
tax
collectors?
collector.
There, we see the tax collectors themselves represented in these followers of Jesus, hand-selected by Jesus to be his hands and feet in bringing God's justice to the earth.
Mhm.
So it's like, did Jesus care about justice? Clearly. Like, he himself is the embodiment of the Old Testament calls for justice. I've often said, just from my perspective, but I also think from a biblical perspective, I got this perspective from reading the Bible, that the being that cares most about justice in the universe is God. That there's no being aside from God, aside from Jesus, that cares about justice more than God and Jesus. And therefore, as his followers, we should also be like very, very much caring, emphasizing justice on earth. I think we can probably agree on that. It's just how to obtain it. It's how do we achieve justice? What is the mode? What is the vehicle by which we achieve this picture of rightness and equilibrium, that justice and peace hand in hand picture? How do we get there? So, I mean, I think all three of us are on the same page that Jesus emphasizes justice, but is the way he sought to achieve justice on earth, is it different than what we commonly see social justice looking like in 2025 in the West?
Well, I mean, I think it's definitely a nuanced response, but for me, it's absolutely there are differences. And one of the things that came to my mind when you brought up Pax Romana, for example, and thinking about today and age, like the concept of Pax Romana of, I'm bigger than you, I'm better than you, I will kick the crap out of you if you don't do what I want you to, if you say something wrong to me, on a macroeconomic military level is exactly what America has done and is doing. And would I say that's wrong? Would I say I disagree with that? And so I do think that there is a lot of nuance. And I'm not just saying that, Pax Romana is today's social justice, not at all. But I think it illustrates the idea that there's a way that makes sense in the world, and I don't discredit it. But I do think that there's such a huge counterculture perspective on justice and how Jesus approached these things. That, just like what we've talked about before, the killing with kindness topic, if anyone heard that episode, talking about, how do we on an individual level deal with our enemies, or how are we supposed to understand these things? It's so counterculture. And so I would hesitate to say if that wouldn't also apply to social justice in the modern day, right?
Yeah, I find that a really difficult question to answer. And partially because, just such different, times. Something that I think is making things difficult now in terms of social justice, and I mentioned it before, is I think that because sort of our politics are so divided right now, it's like both sides are afraid in some ways to like sound like the other. And social justice discussions are like often right in the battle zone. And so, like, as a result, I think some, like you would say, conservative Christians are almost, they don't want to talk too much about social justice because then they're afraid they might start to sound liberal or something like that.
Yeah.
Where biblical justice isn't it's not obviously there's like politics involved, but it's a kingdom thing that's supposed to be occurring, and it's a gospel thing. I think the gospel includes obviously wrongs being made right.
Yeah. And let me jump in there as well. If I had to be specific about some of what would be considered the social justice issues or the key issues of today's age or the last century, right? You are looking at a lot of things like women's rights, and you're looking at how the modern day dealt with slavery and the repercussions of it generations later, right?
Mhm.
So racial issues, you're dealing with minority issues in that same regard. And so I think a lot of these things, the principle of what Jesus approached with, do mirror. They're not different, but it can be, like I said, it can be really easy to go black and white on that. No pun intended, but just trying to understand that a lot of, let's take someone who does consider themselves very politically leaning liberal. A lot of what they champion, a lot of what they really matters and resonates to them do root in value of the individual, regardless of their skin color, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation. And so there's a lot of that where it does fall in line with biblical principles. And so it is a very fascinating topic to me of how people can be on different sides of that aisle, like you were referring to, Michael.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question or not, Nate, but that's why I said
Yeah.
this is definitely a minefield, and one that,
Yeah,
in my
well,
opinion, shouldn't
yeah.
be avoided as often as it is.
Yeah. I mean, this is why it's avoided. It's why it's a minefield of sorts, because it's a dense conversation. It's complicated. But both you guys kind of keyed in on something that I was going to follow up with, which is like, what are the things that modern social justice and the first century Jesus movement, spearheaded by Jesus himself, what are the things they share in common with regard to what they're aiming to achieve? And I think what they share in common, as both of you guys alluded to in different ways, is a desire to see justice. It's a desire to see wrongs righted, a desire to see people not taken advantage of or abused or whatever else. So it's like that's a common point, right? And
Yeah.
in terms of, I mean, because Michael, you're right. There is this fear of emphasizing justice at all in the church today, because heaven forbid you start sounding like them outside the building, or whatever else. But God cares immensely about justice. Jesus also cared immensely about justice. The picture of the end state of things at the end of the biblical narrative is a picture of justice having been achieved and peace having been achieved. That's what we're working towards. That's what the biblical narrative is working towards. So there's a common point there, and that should be affirmed. You know what I mean? Like whenever we are having conversations with people who are on whatever side of the discussion, the shared conviction of the need for justice, the shared desire for justice is affirm that, right? That's a common thread. That's important. It's very, very important to find common threads for people on, all sides of a debate or a discussion. But the rubbing point is this. I don't even want to say, but the rubbing point is this. I want to say the next thing there is about this conversation is there is a rubbing point, which is, how do we get there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We can agree that we want to go there, but how are we going there? And modern social justice is, I'm not going to say exclusively, I'm going to say primarily, I'm going to say dominantly occupied with power structure. Very, very focused on politics, So things from a governmental perspective, economics from a governmental perspective, and then power structures. When we talk about some of the things that are most, like, once you open up that cover that says social justice, once you open up the cover of that book and you start looking at the big chunks of that book, and I'm using a metaphor, we're talking about intersectionality. We're talking about critical race theory. We're talking about things that are concerned about the government, about economics, about wealth distribution, power distribution, gender relationships, minority, majority, the oppressed, the oppressor, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you guys about this. I don't know how much time you guys individually have put into understanding these different things like CRT or intersectionality or whatever else, or how much experience you have with them. But I wanted to ask, if you had to put your finger on, well, I'll put it like this. Are those frameworks, like critical race theory, like critical theory as a whole, like intersectionality, or modern social justice, it's like another word for that, it's like synonymous. Are those frameworks inherently compatible or inherently incompatible with a Christian worldview? Obviously, there's the point where we can, from everyone from all sides of a discussion, can agree on the desire for justice. But in terms of how those movements seek to obtain justice, does that jive in your mind with Jesus' vision for humanity?
Yeah, in my gut, I want to instinctively say that they're not inherently, it doesn't go against that, it can't coexist in that kind of a sense. But there is, there is a lot of nuance to it. I think that unfortunately a lot of these specifics that you brought up, with even at a high level, they are external focused, right? They are, like you said, they're focused on the politics of it, the structure, the outside of an individual's human behavior, or outside of what's going on inside of me internally. And I think that, there a lot of, we're talking about kingdom principles and what Jesus was trying to communicate, and how a lot of times he didn't just say, do X, Y, and Z and not A, B, and C, but instead he was getting at some foundational internal areas in our lives. And so, can they coexist, or are they mutually exclusive? I don't think that they are mutually exclusive, but I think a lot of the times when you focus on external systems, which, like, a lot of these organizations or the ideas that they come up with, the goal is to make that external change. And when you have an external change without an internal change to mirror it, that's when I feel like you are getting off the beaten path of what Jesus is trying to communicate as these principles work in reality versus the ones that don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Michael, any further thoughts there?
Yeah. I might meander a little bit because there's a lot to consider, but
Yeah.
To my understanding, what I know, and my knowledge is probably incomplete for like CRT and everything, but when I've looked at it, one of my thoughts has always been that it's sort of inherently always seeing people groups as they are always going to be at odds. And I think the biblical vision is that need not be so, that justice is in fact supposed to bring about a place where that sort of constant vying for power can be set aside, and sort of the eternal tit for tat can be over. I think something I've seen that I think would be helpful overall in the discussion is, so the Bible does talk about like dealing with systems, I think. Like Isaiah 1:17 does say, like, it says, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and plead the widow's cause. And you can poke around all over the place. It talks about establishing justice in the gates. I think that's in Amos. And the gates are where, legal, declarations were made. And so, and I think modern day, like Christian thoughts on this have sort of shied away from wanting to talk about where systems might have some structures in it that aren't entirely fair. So I think we've often embraced charity, we'll help the poor with some donations. But in terms of challenging unjust systems, I think we're letting CRT do all the talking, and we're not. I feel like there's very little discussion with it to try to necessarily meet people in the similarities and try to talk things through. What I've seen, I think I've seen a lot of churches sort of just shy away from it, and so then our voice just isn't in it at all.
Yeah, they don't even play in that arena, basically. It's a matter of if it's not something that is in our Christian comfortable circles, then we're not even going to step foot in there, because like you alluded before, it can turn into a battle, but it doesn't mean that it should. And unfortunately, by being afraid, or by any number of reasons that can probably make complete rational sense to anyone who actually has been put into this decision before, but by not stepping in, you're not having any influence. You're not having the bad influence, but you're not having the potential for the good influence that we're called to have as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, what are your thoughts on it, Nate?
Yeah, I liked what both of you guys said, and freshest on my mind is what Michael just mentioned about the idea that the Bible does clearly talk about the idea of dismantling oppression, right? And ending systems that perpetuate oppression. You even think about different moments where God, often through agency or through agents, put an end to different oppressive cultures or systems or whatever else. So that's definitely a factor. But then also what you mentioned before with intersectionality, with critical race theory, or just critical theory as a whole, or like modern Marxism, or just whatever term you'd want to put on it. There is this sense, or not this sense, there is the explicitly stated concept that all suffering, all evil comes from oppressive systems.
Yeah.
That everything wrong with society, everything wrong with the earth, can ultimately be laid at the feet of a system that promotes oppression or inequity.
Yeah.
So one person having more than another, one race having more than another, one race having more power than another. All pain, all evil comes from one having more than another. And that therefore the solution is to create systems, so in government and otherwise, that ensure equity, that ensure that everybody has the exact same amount of whatever else, the same amount of power, the same amount of representation, the same amount of wealth, so on and so forth. So there's the thing I affirm there is yes, we should, whenever there's a system that perpetuates injustice in the earth, we should stop it.
Yeah.
But as a follower of Jesus, I'm pretty fundamentally opposed to the idea that all evil in the world is because of one having more than another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's very possible to have the same amount as somebody else and then to want more and then
Absolutely.
to seek more. From a biblical perspective, that's just the way things are. And then here comes Jesus with his vision of what it means to be human and his vision of what it means to heal creation and heal humanity. And for him, he rebukes the words of the Peters whipping out the sword and going it's go time, let's overthrow the enemy. He says, if I wanted to, I certainly could do that. The Father could send me right now 12 legions of angels and I could take care of business if that was the answer. But Jesus seems very, very firmly convinced that the problem with humanity is not one having more than another, and it's not even just a political system, but
Yeah.
rather there's something internal to the human. And you mentioned this as well, Tony.
That's right.
Not just an external thing, but there's something about me. There's
Mhm.
something about us. We are divided. We are not a family. We are not following God's vision for what it means to be human. We follow our own vision for what it means to be human.
Easy.
And that fundamental picture, like all the way from Genesis 3, embracing our desire to be our own God and our own authority, all the way through Jesus' ministry and beyond, this idea that I will be the kind of human I want to be, rather than I will trust God's vision for what it means to be me, what it means to be a human. In Jesus' view, in the biblical view, that is what is fundamentally wrong with humanity. And so in that perspective, it isn't a system first and foremost that is the problem from Jesus' perspective. Could he have dismantled the corrupt temple system? Yes. Could he have dismantled? I mean, and to be clear, Jesus stood against the corrupt temple system. He went into the temple and protested it. It protested the corruption.
Flipping tables.
But the final solution then was not to kill the enemy, or was not to force a new system. He allowed himself to be killed by that system to ultimately open up the way into a new, actualized humanity, beginning individually, but then spreading into a new family, like a new way to be human, a Jesus kind of human. So in that sense, like there's multiple things where I can like resonate with the modern social justice movement, intersectionality,
Absolutely.
critical race theory. I can say like that's so valuable, that's so good, and you've keyed on something that God really values.
Yeah.
But the idea that ultimately one having more than the other is the problem, or a system that perpetuates one having more than the other is the problem, that can be a problem, but I firmly stand against the idea that that is the problem.
Yeah, I think what you're highlighting on too, Nate, don't mind me if I'm interrupting
No,
a
you're
little,
good.
please. For anyone who's listening to us, like that, this is one of our primary goals of this podcast is to not just talk about some of these ideas, and have in-depth conversation, of course, but to really challenge what are those ideas that exist on a foundational level, the kind of ideas that you might not intentionally realize that you're thinking about them or seeing other things through, but they're the ideas that you put on your glasses every day, and they do shade everything else. All the other things are built upon those. And one could argue that every idea has that kind of influence one degree or another. But those presuppositions that we have, and what you were just saying, Nate, like understanding that, look, there's a lot of I can see a lot of good in people's hearts when it comes to critical race theory, when it comes to any take X, Y, and Z controversial political agenda that someone has. And are we going to really sit here and say that someone's pushing that because they're trying to be manipulative and selfish and they are just of the enemy, they are the devil? And 9 times out of 10, that's not the case. Now, I'm not gonna say that there aren't people who are malicious, intentionally being malicious out there on both sides of the political aisle, on both sides of a religious aisle, but like understanding that people do inherently want what's good. People do inherently want justice, this topic we're talking about today. But like what Nate is saying, how do we get to that justice? We really do have to look at some of these presuppositional ideas and recognize that even though, yes, I agree with what you're trying to do, what you're building it on just does not make rational and reasonable sense in reality. Not even if we're talking about Christianity, right? Nate, like if we're really evaluating this idea that, hey, because you have more than me, or your people group has more than my people group, and we need to change these systems, then the question then becomes, okay, well, once those systems are changed and these people groups are as equal as they possibly can be, have the equity as matching as possible, will that prevent further selfishness? Will that prevent further choices that says, I don't care about the consequences, I want what I think is best for me? And so I think what you're hitting on there, Nate, and like I said, apologies if I interrupted, is so critical to what we are trying to center this podcast around. So thank you for going in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Yeah, I just like Jesus' vision for what humanity should be resonates so firmly in just what I've seen in my own life, where on this other side of the discussion, critical race theory or critical theory would say ultimately humans, the solution is not in changing the person. Michael, you said this as well. Like fundamentally, according to critical race theory, this is one of the basic tenets. Fundamentally, humans are racist, and that will never change. That can never change. That will never change. And there's no attempt from critical race theory or proponents of critical race theory to make people less racist. That isn't the express goal. The express goal is to obtain equity through a dismantling of systems that perpetuate inequity and through the establishment of systems that force equity. And that is a heartbreaking vision of humanity for me. I want to be a person that is less broken and less hateful and less bitter. Mm-hmm. And here comes Jesus saying, you weren't made to be this way. Follow me into a new human that is daily less hateful, that is daily less selfish, that is daily more quick and holistic in your embracing of love. That is what resonates with me. And I think what resonates with so many people who are enraptured, who are attracted to the light of Jesus, that this idea that we weren't made to be this way, but there's a way forward. Yeah. So it's like justice and dismantling of oppressive systems. Amen. Amen. But I don't want to end there looking at only the external things. I want to be somebody, and I want everybody to be somebody that ultimately so fully embraces Jesus' vision for humanity that over time we're able to live it out in consistency, such that the entire world is justice.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really does bring up a further question in my mind. But before I pose that, moving on to our episode, I just wanted to check, Michael, did you have any final thoughts on that you wanted to input?
I think, maybe just one or two thoughts, because I don't know, I'm always kind of fielding certain amounts of questions up here in Madison, Wisconsin. If you want to talk about justice in church communities, people will, accuse you of turning into a left-wing socialist or something like that. Mm. And, for people who have hearts for justice, you don't have to prescribe to a particular political agenda for that. Like, biblical justice predates Karl Marx. The Bible is calling to care for the poor, to fight oppression, to seek equality of peoples. It's in there. I think the sad thing for me is that people think that it's like socialist or Marxist to help the poor and challenge injustice, and it's not considered a Christian thing. I guess they're just confusing the, heart and methods of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, another thing people are often, I hear all the time here in Madison, they'll point at Acts and say the early church was a pack of communists because of all that. And it's like, no, that isn't the case, actually. They shared voluntarily. They were motivated by love. There was no government coercion there. Yeah. I'm fine with, I'll vote for people who want to have the government have some social programs. I'm okay with that. I don't mind if my tax money goes towards feeding low-income pregnant mothers, making sure they can get some good fruits and veggies. I like that kind of thing. I certainly wish and hope that churches would do more of that, but I also recognize that I'm cool with whatever system wants to do it. But anyway, I don't want to get too far down the...
I totally understand that. And like with government, for example, I think that can be a very fascinating topic in and of itself, is understanding,
Yeah.
what's the role of government, and when should they step in, and when should maybe there should be more of the church jumping into the arena, like what we mentioned before, Michael, that they have a tendency
Yeah.
not to. And the reality is when they don't, or when we don't as individuals, then who does? And so
Yeah.
I definitely understand, the desire for external government to regulate some of these things that we do see the heart behind, that we do see the inherent good or the inherent desire for justice. But Nate, this is where I feel like, it leads us to the next question, the next easy topic, I feel like, is gonna be asking ourselves not what if we just discuss what justice looks like on an external level and the systems, and like we said, we can go into a whole other conversation about the specifics of what government on a social level looks like. Well, then what on the other side of that coin is the kind of government on God's level look like? How does God influence us as opposed to what some of these systems would influence us?
Yeah. What does it look like for God to partner with a human?
Exactly.
What does it look
Yeah.
like for the Holy Spirit to fill somebody? What did it look like for the writers of the Bible to do that?
Mhm.
There's a lot we could go into there, and I think we will go into that
Absolutely.
next time. Until next time, y'all, take it easy.